Brian, to ask the classic question, what is truth, really is very probative of wanting to understand reality. And I'd like to focus with you on a subset of truth, necessary truths. What are necessary truths?
Okay, first is sort of a definition. A necessary truth is one such that it's impossible that it be false. Or to put it in slightly different words, it's one that couldn't possibly be false. Explain that? Well, consider any possibility you want. If it's a genuine possibility, then every necessary truth is going to be true in that possibility. So suppose, for example, that it's necessarily true that 2 and 2 makes 4. Then in every possibility, 2 and 2 are going to make 4. And
so you can have a world or a universe or billions of universes in all different ways you want to construct them. In every one of those, 2 plus 2 has to equal 4.
Right.
And, okay, I understand 2 plus 2 equal 4. Now, what are the categories of necessary truths? I mean, how many are there?
I probably don't know an infinite number that would go that high. You can sort them as to what they're about. I mean, logical and mathematical truths are one division. Then there are also what I call secular necessary truths, which are necessary truths that don't include God or apply to God or aren't about God in certain ways. And those would be things like, that there are no married bachelors, perhaps more controversially, things about the essences of creatures. Suppose that it's an essential property of human beings to be rational, then that all humans are rational would be a secular necessary truth.
Okay. I want to understand the categories. Did you have, you putting logic and mathematics in the same category?
No, I didn't want to at any rate. I wanted to set them over against the secular, though, because logic and mathematics do apply to God. Whereas the secular truths are things about things other than God, things that don't really apply to God.
So we start with 2 broad categories.
Yeah.
Those that could be about God or are about God, and those that have nothing to do with God.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So you call one secular necessary truths, and the ones that could involve God?
Non-secular.
Oh, non-secular, because they could involve God, or they don't have to involve God.
Right.
And in that category, you have logic and mathematics.
Right, because if there is a God, they apply to God, among other things.
Right, okay. All right, so let's look at each of those 2 categories. Describe each one for me a little bit.
Okay, the secular necessary truths are the ones that haven't, in their subject matter, anything to do with God. For example, all humans are rational, supposing that is an example. I hold that those are truths that God, in a very strong sense, invented. He dreamed up what it is to be human. And as part of that, he defined human nature, and he made it the case that to be human includes being rational. On the other hand, the non-secular ones, those of logic and mathematics, I don't think God invented those at all. Rather, they have roots in his very nature. Logic describes certain basic ways that God thinks. And because they're God's thoughts, they wind up getting imprinted on the structure of all possible worlds.
Could it have been otherwise?
With regard to logic and mathematics, okay, I'm going to stick to the case of logic because I can speak to that in more detail. I think there's a respect in which logic could have been otherwise, and there's a respect in which it couldn't have been otherwise. Let's suppose, consider a formula of pure logic, like for any proposition P, if it's the case that P, and it's the case that P implies Q, then it's the case that Q. That proposition is at least non-false, and it may also be true. I would say that as a matter of God's nature, it couldn't have been other than non-false. However, it may be that God has some discretion over whether it comes out true.
Yeah, you gotta give me help on that one, because non-false and true seem like the same thing.
Okay, we ordinarily would think that way, but there's a third possibility: neither true nor false. Something can be non-false and be neither true nor false.
Okay.
So
what's an example?
On some views that I am bald, might at one point have been an example. Right now, I clearly am bald. But 20 years ago, I was sort of a middle case. You might have looked at me and said, "Well, he's got just about enough hair. Maybe he's bald. Maybe he's not."
So the vagueness of baldery.
Exactly, exactly. And there are these vague cases that may be cases of being neither true nor false. The thing that God has some discretion over is over whether the world is such that there are really any of these neither true nor false cases in it. If there are genuine no truth value, neither true nor false cases in the world, then there are no logical truths, but there are logical things that can't be false, even though they're not true, strictly speaking, either. And the proposition of logic that I gave you is one example of that. It can't be false, but maybe it's not really true either.
So the one that can't be false, God does not have control over.
Okay, let me rephrase that. God has no control over whether it is the case that that proposition is non-false. But if it's up to God whether the world contains any genuine vague cases where it's neither true nor false, then it's also up to God whether that proposition is true, or, on the other hand, just itself neither true nor false.
The fact that we have necessary truths, which can be secular or can be non-secular, that God can be involved in, how much rooted in God are they for their existence? Because it would seem that on points of logic, like this couch is sort of a brown yellow, and it's also colored. It can't be one without the other. I mean, it can't be colored, and it can't be yellow but not be colored. Could God have made that different?
I don't think God could have made that different, but God could have made it the case that there weren't even such things as color properties. And if he'd done that, it wouldn't have been true either. Now, I spoke very imprecisely. I don't want to say, strictly speaking, that God could have done that, because that's saying it's possible that there not have been color properties, and actually that's an impossibility. But my thought is that the way things are with regard to what's possible is itself something that comes from God. And so it's God's doing that there are, or there can be, yellow things, and that if they're yellow, they're necessarily going to be colored.
Why are you so strongly desirous that everything of such abstract natures be rooted in God?
You can answer that both from the philosophical side and from what you might call the theological side. From the theological side, I think it's desirable to hold, if you can, that absolutely everything comes from God somehow. From the philosophical side, I think holding that this is the way things are answers some genuine philosophical difficulties. For instance, if things like the possibility of there being yellow don't come from God, then they may have their roots in what philosophers call abstract objects, things like color properties, just kind of hanging out there beyond space and time. If that's really what we're knowing things about, when we're knowing such things as that if something is yellow, it is colored, then it becomes hard to explain how we could ever have gotten our minds around that at all. How could our minds reach out beyond space and time and get a grip on an abstract object like that? If there are no abstract objects, then you don't have to answer that kind of question. But then you've got to come up with a different basis for these things being possible or not. And that's where God comes into the picture.
And so therefore, as you look at all necessary truths of any kind, all of them are completely dependent on God.
In one way or another. Some are rooted directly in his being. Some, on the other hand, are there because he thought in a certain way, because he invented certain natures for things to have.